All right, so let's begin talking about the true vocal folds. So far, you tend to see me use like a hand signal where I'm putting my two hands together to indicate that the true vocal folds are really two-sided. In actuality, they're much smaller. They are made of muscle, but they're about the size of your thumbnails. And the most similar thing we have in other musical instruments is called a double-reeded instrument, like the oboe, I believe. But again, what's so amazing about the voice as an instrument, and especially these true folds, is that they're organic and they're shape-shifting, and they can take on different characteristics. So I want to maybe demonstrate that, or at least explain it by using not the oboe as an example, but the guitar, because we're all very familiar with the guitar strings. So what's interesting with the guitar strings, if you think about it, is that the guitar strings all have, if you're not touching them with your left hand, with your playing hand, the strings are all the same length, but they produce different pitches. The thicker string produces a lower pitch, and the thinner strings produce a higher pitch. So what we can say is thickness tends to have a lower pitch, and thinness has a higher pitch, okay? Another thing that we see with guitar strings is that when we do press somewhere on a string, on a fret somewhere, that the pitch goes up. We go higher in pitch on that string because we've shortened the length, the vibrating length. We shortened the vibrating length of that string. Okay, so now we've got two characteristics of these guitar strings. We have thickness and we have vibrating length. Okay, and then another thing we have is, of course, we tune the guitar with these keys, the tuning keys at the head of the guitar, and tighter raises the pitch and looser lowers the pitch. Okay, and we also note that the thicker strings have a deeper quality. They have a different tonal quality. It's a little deeper and thicker in a way. They're thicker strings and they produce what seems like a thicker sound, whereas the thinner strings tend to be lighter and thinner sound as well. So when we're looking at the guitar strings, then we can say that the parameters or differences can be the thickness, it can be the tension, it can be the vibrating length. Okay, so we have these same qualities in these two little tiny vocal folds, is that they can self-adjust, they can shape-shift, they can become thicker, they can become more or less tense in the way they're stretched, and they can also change the vibrating length. Now the vibrating length, it's really, I'm sitting here doing this with my thumbs, you can't see it anyway, but the vibrating length, the way they change vibrating length, it's really good to think of it as like a zipper. So what they do is they zip up at one end, and so the hole gets smaller, because it's really the size of the hole has a very important effect on pitch. So let's introduce another vocabulary word. There's a word called glottis. Some of you may have heard the word glottis. I used to think the glottis meant the true vocal folds, but the glottis is actually, when they open, it's the hole, the empty space in between them. Okay, so the size of the glottis or the size of the hole can have an effect on pitch, as well as other characteristics of the sound. And you'll also hear the expression subglottal pressure. So subglottal pressure is basically the amount of air pressure coming up from the aerator, from the production of air pressure, to the false vocal folds. And it's probably a combination of how hard they're closed, the size of the hole in the glottis when it's open, and the tension, as well as the air pressure. And so you're talking about if your folds are very tightly closed and thick and pressed together, so there's a lot of resistance, you're going to have a lot more subglottal pressure as long as you're producing some air pressure below. Okay, so to understand the nature of these true folds, realize that they can change their tension, they can change the vibrating length, they can change their thickness. And then one other thing that's a little more advanced is, even though they're horizontal in their normal position, they can actually be raised up at one end slightly so that they're slightly diagonal, tipping down. doing that is where we have this change in effect we call resonation or resonance, sometimes ring, twang, singer's formant. They're all ways to describe this type of change in the harmonic quality of the sound. And this is all done with the true vocal folds. Okay, so now what I said in the prior video is in the Estill model of the voice, she has defined 13 figures that are distributed through these 3 parts of the instrument, such that 7 of them are in the intonator, what we're talking about now. And of those 7, 2 of them are assigned to the true vocal folds. So what does that mean? Let's separate those and then talk about them separately. So much like the example I gave in the last lesson about a singer's phrase, the singer's phrase is actually, a number of syllables in one exhale, and there's a beginning, there's a middle, and there's an end. Well, when you think about what happens when you're making a sound, now we're really talking about individual syllables for the most part. So there's multiple syllables inside a singer's phrase. There can be just one as well, one or more. But when we're talking about just making a sound, we're talking about usually just like a syllable that's often separated by consonants. Most often when a consonant is introduced, the sound making comes to a stop and then it starts again, and we started a new cycle of the true vocal fold. So what we're talking about is the cycle of making sound with the true vocal fold. And so that cycle has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Okay, but we're talking about really 2 things, because the beginning and the end are they're very similar. So Joe Estill combined them together and called them onset and offset. So we have the true vocal fold, onset and offset. And then the middle part is the portion where now the folds are vibrating. They're connected and they're vibrating. In some case, in falsetto, they're not quite connected, but they're still vibrating. So we have the onset, the vibrating phase of the connection, and then we have the offset when the sound is stopped. Okay, so let's talk about those separately, and we'll begin with the onset. I don't concern myself with the offset. It happens naturally, but I am, in my training and my singing, I do concern myself with the onset, and I'll explain that now. Okay, so now we're talking about one of the 2 figures or 2 elements of the true vocal folds, the onset. Onset and offset, we're going to speak about the onset. This is how sound is initiated for each syllable. So there's really 3 ways that this can be done. One of them is a breathy way, where in the Estill method it's called the spirit onset. I usually call it the breathy onset. So an example of this is using the letter H in front of a vowel. So imagine what Santa Claus says. So Santa Claus says, ho, 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 ho. That's the breathy onset. One of the characteristics of the breathy onset is that it tends to be the easier of the 3. So you'll find in your vocal training, possibly in a private voice lesson, you'll find that if you're getting higher in pitch and it's getting harder and harder to do, sometimes if you put a little of that air, a little bit of the H into the onset, it'll make it easier. And then you try to remove the breath once they come together and enter the vibrating state. Okay, so one onset is the breathy onset. Another offset, which Joe Estill called the glottal onset, which I call the abrupt onset. To me, it makes more sense that it's the abrupt way. So one way to understand how this is, using the same vowel O, is that instead of ho, 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 we could use an example like uh-oh, like a child might say when something bad happens. Uh-oh, uh-oh. So give that a try if you're not doing it already, and realize that they come together, the sound and the air sort of start at the exact same time, very abruptly, and there's almost like a little click. Uh-oh, you feel that little click. That's harder to do than the breathy onset. But it's what we tend to do most of the time. Okay, so the third onset is kind of a mix between the two. It's sort of a blend between the two, which she calls the smooth onset, which I think is probably a good name for it. I don't think I have a separate name for it. The best way to know this sound is to put a Y, the letter Y, the sound of a letter Y in front of the vowel. So in the case of the O vowel, it would be yo, 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 yo. So to recap these three onsets, again, you can practice them, but really they're just something to keep in mind, is that you can onset a sound with a breathiness, like ho, ho, ho. You can onset it with very abruptly, uh-oh, uh-oh, or you can do a smooth blended onset, which is yo, yo, yo. The phrase, how are you? How are you actually has all three. So how is the breathy onset, the aspirate onset. R is the glottal onset or the abrupt onset. And U is the smooth or blended onset. Okay, so those are the three types of onsets, and they're the same as the offset. You can end a sound on those three, but I tend to not even notice it, or I don't pay any attention to it. But those are the three different onsets. Okay, so now let's move, and we're going to talk about when we're in the vibrating state. Okay, so the second of the two parts of the true vocal folds is the vibrating state. What Joe Estill called this the true vocal fold body cover. So I'm not entirely sure what she meant by that, but this is really referring to the thickness and the tension and the length of the vocal folds that I spoke about earlier with the guitar string example. So once we've onset the sound, we've made sound, we've onset the sound, and what are we doing? We're making a vowel at a pitch with a tone and a volume. Those are really the four main things that are happening with the true vocal folds. Okay, so once we've onset it and we've brought the folds together, they're now in a state of vibration, and this she calls the true vocal fold body cover. This is responsible for those four qualities, and the way to demonstrate it, just to become aware of it, because you do it all the time, of course, is any sound you're making, or a better example is just to sustain the sound. So instead of just speaking, you can go ah, oh, e. You make these sounds. That's the vibrating phase of the cycle of the true vocal folds. And in that phase, the main way that we change pitch is through changing the vibrating length of the folds through this kind of zip up process. And so a great way to demonstrate that is to simply do what are called sirens. So let me do a quick example for you. I'll do some sirens where I'll do a siren, a couple at lower pitches, and then I'll sort of go up within the same breath. I'll kind of siren up higher and higher. And what I'm essentially doing is I'm changing the vibrating length of the vocal folds, which is altering the pitch. What's also happening is that because I'm going higher in pitch, I naturally have to change the thickness. In the lower range of your voice, the vocal folds tend to be thicker, and they need to be thinned out as you get higher in pitch to be able to make those higher sounds without a lot of stress. So let me just demonstrate something here. And I'm out of breath. So that's essentially, it's all one connection, and I'm cycling through sirening through a vowel with the mouth closed, so it's nasaling, right? Humming or nasaling. And I'm changing the vibrating length, and as I get higher in pitch, the vocal folds are getting thinner, so I don't feel a lot of buildup of pressure. Okay? Now, another exercise that you can do, and this is a great exercise that we'll probably be doing in the vocal training course, is to change the thickness of the vocal folds. Really thick vocal folds with really good resistance have a great tonal quality. So people really want to keep especially men, want to keep those vocal folds nice and thick and pressed together, even as they climb in range and pitch. And that can actually get them into problems because they need to learn how to thin those out to release some of that tension and some of that thickness in order to keep the reactionary muscles from overreacting and jumping in and causing that feeling of stress and squeezing and self-suffocation. So I'm going to give a little demonstration here and maybe add something later, but the idea is you can, on a given pitch, you can sing that pitch or make that sound at different thicknesses of the vocal folds. This is usually called, in vocal training, it's called doing crescendos and decrescendos, because not only are you changing the thickness, but usually the thicker folds make a louder sound, so you're changing the volume as well. So let me try to give an example here. And I might not be right on pitch, but if I go, you can hear, hopefully you can hear that I tried not to change pitch. I think it did go up a little bit, but I'm essentially changing the thickness without changing the pitch. And we'll be doing much more of that in our vocal training, but I just wanted to make you aware of it. So those are two ways to demonstrate. And again, you can, after this video's over or at any time, pause the video and experiment with sirens, which show you how you change the length of the folds. And you can experiment with some of this crescendo and decrescendo, speaking a little lighter, speaking at the same pitch but a little softer, a little lighter, or speaking at the same pitch and being, a little thicker and stronger. What I'm just really doing is increasing the tension and the thickness of the folds. So that is the second part of the true vocal folds, which is what happens when they're together and vibrating. So we already talked, just to recap a bit, is that the true folds can change thickness, tension, and vibrating length. They can also change the angle at which they sit, which is more advanced, so we're not going to demonstrate that here. And their use is usually divided into two parts. The onset and offset is one part, and then the portion where you're sustaining the vowel sound, which is when they're connected and vibrating. Okay? So that's it. We're going to move on now into the false vocal folds.